I spent most of my life as a hunting guide on the border of Montana and Wyoming. I did some work for Fish and Wildlife in both states. During the off-season, I worked as a range rider tracking wildlife populations and making sure the large predators don't get too close to civilization. I was who they called when they had to track and dispatch problematic wildlife for the safety of the public. It's not what I would call a fun job, but I was damn good at it. I was called out to northwestern Wyoming to track down a problematic brown bear. The reports of the bear were just outside of Yellowstone. Oddly, no one had directly seen the bear, but it had been caused severe damage to vehicles and campers in the area. All signs pointed towards a territorial bear. The local park service tried to track it down before they called me with no success. The most recent report of the bear was from a road crew working to fix some mountain roads that were washed out by recent flooding in the area. Luckily, no one was injured, but the bear destroyed 2 hard-sided campers that the workers were staying in. That was the last place the bear was spotted, so it was first on my list. I'm a little old school when it comes to hunting and tracking, so I drove up there with my truck and horse trailer. I know a lot of guys that use ATVs out here, but a good horse will do you much better. The road up the mountain was windy and slow-going. I didn't reach the camp until mid-morning. I saw the damage before I even had my truck in park. The sides of the camper were completely slashed through. Bears can definitely do this kind of damage, but it's not at all common. But every once in a while you'll get a rogue bear that's just out to get everybody. Like I said, it doesn't happen often, but when it does, the only thing to do is put the bear down. I talked to one of the workers who was in the camper at the time of the attack. He said he didn't get a good look at it, but saw it had brown fur, which means it's a grizzly. He claimed to have shot it twice with a 12-gauge dead center in the chest, but said the bear didn't drop. A charging bear has a lot of adrenaline in its body. They can be mortally wounded and still maul you to death before they die. There was a good probability that the bear was severely wounded and ran off somewhere to die if he was telling the truth. I found a decent blood trail leading into the forest. I saddled up my horse and set off down the trail, leading her on foot. Had I known I'd be following a track, I would have brought a dog, but the blood trail was substantial enough to easily follow. From the look of it so far, I was expecting to find either a dead or nearly dead brown bear very soon. That was not the case. I followed that track well into dusk. I knew I should have turned back earlier, but I just couldn't imagine an animal that lost such a significant amount of blood to have gone so far. I was in a situation where I would either have to camp or try to travel out through some extremely rugged terrain in the dark. Neither option sounded good to me, but I was too far on this track to give up and come back in the morning. I knew I couldn't sleep out here with a wounded grizzly potentially close by, so I decided to follow the track into the night. The blood on the leaves was still warm. This thing was so close, it could probably see me. I just wanted to get this bear dead so I could get a good night's sleep out here and ride out in the morning. My horse started getting antsy as we continued on the track. I knew we were nearly there. I saw a lump of brown fur lying on the forest floor in the shadows. I had my rifle positioned on it, but there was something strange about the situation. I turned the brightness up on my headlamp to get a better look at the beast. The first thing I noticed was that it was still breathing. The second thing I noticed was that its fur, while brown, was not a bear's fur. It was much longer, like something you would see on a yak. I made some noise to see if it would move. I really wanted to see its face, but it just laid there. My horse suddenly spooked from something moving behind us. I spun around to see what it was, but I didn't see anything between the trees. I looked back at the creature, and it was still laying there in the dirt. I heard what sounded like people walking through the forest. It was coming from all directions. And that's when I saw the first one. It must have been 7 feet tall. It was covered in the same long brown hair as the creature curled up in the dirt. Its face looked almost human, but not quite. Its skin was tan and leathery from what I could tell with my headlamp. My horse was properly freaked out by the sight, as was I, if I'm honest. The creature approached the injured one and knelt down next to it. and then another one came out from the shadows and joined the other two. I didn't know what to do. I knew how to handle an encounter with just about every wild animal out there, but these were something else. It looked like they were trying to help the injured one, and in that moment, I was afraid they would attack me, thinking I was the one who shot their friend. I slowly turned my horse around. The creatures just stared at me. I don't know why, but I tried speaking to them. I told them that I was looking for a bear and that I'm not a threat to them, and that we were promptly leaving. I can't tell if they understood me or not, but they let me leave. I rode through the night to get out of there. I continued on working as a range rider and a hunting guide for another 12 years after that incident, and I never saw any of those creatures again, but I have heard stories from others. They aren't seen very often, but they are out there. It's hard to believe that so many mystical creatures and beings exist in the world, and thought that maybe some people were exaggerating or straight up lying. Well, I no longer believe that. After hearing so many stories, I felt inspired to try to hunt down one of these things myself. I grew up in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, which is right on the border of Pennsylvania and Delaware. There's a state park close by, Brandywine State Park, where the famous battle was fought. A small part of that park is known as Beaver Valley. From satanic cults to a town full of little people, the number of conspiracies surrounding the place can lead you down quite the rabbit hole. I've been there in the daytime once or twice. Some people used it as a shortcut when Naaman's Road was backed up, but never at night and never on any of the roads that supposedly harbored evil spirits. Well, one night after getting out of work around 11 at night, but feeling adventurous, I called my buddy Alan to see if he wanted to check the place out with me. He agreed, and within a half hour I had picked him up and we were on our way. The park itself is pretty big, and there are multiple roads leading into and out of it. Navigating it can be a little confusing, and cell phone service sucks down there, so GPS apps don't always work. Alan said he knew his way around, but I didn't really believe him. It didn't matter. I didn't have anything else to do this late at night anyway. Driving through the outskirts of the park was a little bit creepy. A few people live back there, but there's no streetlights at all. The only illumination we had was being cast by my car's headlights. The roads rose and fell and curved often, sometimes sharply, so I had to give driving my full attention. Eventually, we found what we were really looking for. Satan's Road, so called because of the way the trees grow along the road. They all curve away from the road as if they are trying to uproot and escape something coming from deeper within the forest. I've heard about it plenty of times, but actually seeing it, well, it's a very different experience. There's rumors of cults practicing satanic rituals here in the wood. Recalling the rumors and seeing the trees, I was starting to feel like I had my fill of weirdness for the night. I was thinking about getting through as fast as I could and getting back out onto one of the large roads when Alan gave a surprised yelp from the passenger seat. He told me that he was looking in the forest beside the car and had seen something running alongside before disappearing into the brush. He didn't know what it was, but said it could have been a deer or something. There's a lot of them back here. I hoped so and kept driving. I figured we were 3/4 of the way through when I rounded another sharp curve and had to slam my brakes on. I had almost hit him. Right in front of the car, about 10 feet away, shining in the headlights, stood a completely naked man. It's January and the temperatures have been dropping into the 30s lately, so the guy should have been freezing. A tall, thin man, filthy with long, matted brown hair and an unkempt beard, stood staring into the windshield, not shivering or showing any signs of being exposed to the cold air. His breath wasn't even fogging. Me and Alan sat silently, both too shocked to say anything, and honestly, I was extremely scared. It started to get colder. Even inside the car, I started to shiver slightly, and then a moment later, uncontrollably, Alan was doing the same next to me. I began coming around to what was happening and reached down to put the car in reverse. Something was telling me to get the hell out of there and leave the naked guy standing in the road. The car wouldn't move. Pressing the gas, the engine wouldn't even rev. I wasn't even sure it was on anymore. My head was beginning to feel foggy. Thoughts and ideas kept forming in my head but slipping away before they could take root. I vaguely remember Alan next to me reciting something that sounded like a Bible verse. As far as I know, Alan isn't particularly religious, and I found it odd that he could quote passages from the Bible. The man started to move, slowly stepping backward methodically, foot after foot. Still staring right into the windshield at me and Alan, he backed away completely out of view of the headlights. All that was in front of us was a stretch of empty road. I started warming up immediately and the fogginess began drifting away. Then I saw the eyes. Ahead on the road, coming from where the man had disappeared, were a pair of narrowed red orbs, hovering around 8 feet off the ground. They were moving slowly up and down as if attached to something moving. The creature slowly appeared in view of the light. It had the shape and size of a horse, but the head was a sick cross between a ram and a man. Curling horns jutted from both sides and wisps of dark fur, but the nose and mouth were unmistakably human. The fogginess returned tenfold, and I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I woke up to banging on the window next to my head. I had an excruciating headache, and there was a light being shined in my face. It was a police officer. In short, we had come to in a small clearing off the roundabout 3 miles away from where we had been. Alan had passed out as well, and neither of us could recall anything. The police officer asked us a lot of questions and even searched the car for drugs and gave me a breathalyzer. We told him everything, and by the time we were done, he must have just thought we were some kind of weird loonies and wanted to be rid of us, so we hadn't really done anything illegal. At least I don't think so he let us go. I don't know how we ended up in the clearing, and I don't remember what happened after we saw the thing. Bits and pieces are coming back to me slowly. I'm trying to think of all kinds of excuses. Maybe something was up with my car, and we got a non-lethal dose of carbon monoxide or something, I don't know. Since that night, there are random moments where I feel a sense of overwhelming terror, like something horrible is only seconds away from happening. And for some reason, the date August 17th, 2026, is constantly on my mind. I can't get it out of my head, and I have no idea why. There's an entire city floating on the Caspian Sea. It's sinking, but it's there. 300 kilometers of bridges, roadways, complexes, and oil rigs. I worked there for 4 years. It was a perilous and thankless job. Most of the world doesn't know that oil rocks exists. The money I made was good, though. It kept me out of trouble for a while. Unfortunately for me and every poor soul working those rigs, trouble came to oil rocks. It came for us and we couldn't escape it. Out there, trouble rolled in like the fog. The first guy disappeared a 1.5 years in. He vanished off the side of a rig. No splash, no nothing. The ocean has a way of swallowing you whole, I guess. It's swallowing the whole city. Regardless, we should have known something was up then. They kept his disappearance quiet, the higher-ups. When we asked to review the security footage from the area he was working, they outright refused. Red flag, right? The thing about red flags is they're still so easy to ignore. It isn't red or green or any color at all if you decide to just look the other way. That's what we did. We looked away and we went on with our lives, working in the middle of the Caspian Sea. After that disappearance, we had a few more months of peace. Then we only had trouble. I wish I could say I'd seen it first. I didn't. I did hear it, though. One night, the whole ocean sounded like it was croaking. It sounded like a sea of frogs. None of us could see anything in the dark water, but the company assured us that it was just the sounds of migrating whales. I've heard whales before. I've seen and studied whales. Those sounds weren't coming from any whale that lives in our sea. It came back a couple nights later. This time there was a splash. Because we heard our man hit the water, we knew where to look. We got a flotation device in his arms, and we were hoisting him up in no time. A few blankets later, and the guy was right as rain, toasty and chatting us up. Escaping death is pretty exciting, I guess. He said somebody pushed him. We knew he'd been alone in the area and every other guy was accounted for. Nobody living on oil rocks could have reached him, let alone thrown him over the railing. We mandated a buddy system after that. Trouble didn't care. It came for us in twos. 2 guys that I started with were the next to encounter the croaking thing from the Caspian Sea. They were attacked. Maimed would be a better description. The company had to bury their injuries under the guise of an equipment malfunction. We work with some heavy machinery, but nothing that could cut into you like the 2 guys were cut. It was ugly. They lived, as far as I know. I don't know how we escaped it without any fatalities, but we did. Over the course of the next few weeks, more and more of us started to see it. My buddy described it as a man with a head of seaweed for hair. Others said it looked like an alien. I saw it one time, just the once, as it slipped off of the rig and fell into the ocean. It's hard to describe, I guess. There's nothing to compare it to in a way that feels justified. It had arms like a man. It had legs like a man. I thought I saw hands, webbed fingers, coming out of all 4 of those limbs. Its skin was thick and warty like a toad or a frog, I forget which one. Its stomach was bulbous like a pregnant girl's. Its eyes were wide-set, large and red. It turns my stomach just to thick about that face. It hurts to think about the long mouth and the rows of needlepoint teeth. It wasn't a whale, I'll tell you that much. It was a nightmare. I spotted it as it fled another point of attack. It had come for one of the ladies working at oil rocks. She was smarter than the rest of us, apparently, because she picked up a wrench and taught that thing a lesson. She was covered in a mucus-like blood that certainly wasn't hers. That was when the Iranians came in. Government types, they only gave their credentials to our superiors. The rest of us just did what they said. Quarantine. Some of us were sent home, myself included. The lady covered in that mucus was hauled back to the mainland. I don't know what became of her, and I've never wanted to ask. The last thing she said to any of us was, "It's starting to burn." Can you imagine that? Being covered in the blood of something that tried to kill you, and that slime is starting to give you a rash? The way she said it, I'll never forget. Starting to burn, only starting. She was scratching and patting at her skin like smoke was coming off it. Then they took her away. If burning was only the start, what came next? Did they take her to a hospital or a lab? I guess I'm just lucky that I wasn't with her. Over those few weeks, we were forced to accept a very hard truth. Out there on oil rocks, we fancied ourselves the smartest things around. We went looking for privacy, thinking we could demand it from nature. Nature had a different plan. Nature taught us that no matter how many bridges we build, or how many rigs we stab into the earth, we are not the masters of the ocean or the land. We aren't even safe on the structures that we built. At any point in time, something can rush up from the dark and drag you back into the depths. My work has led me to a lot of places. You'll need to know why I was out in the middle of nowhere if you're going to believe the rest of this. I'm a contractor. I specialize in flooring installation. Carpet, wood, concrete. If you walk on it, I put it down. Everyone needs floors, you see. Even the government. Even in places they don't want many people to be walking. That's enough of the spooky, ominous meandering. To tell you the truth, I was excited to take the job. They were hiring a crew to lay down a new floor in a New Mexico aircraft hangar. Pay was extraordinary. It wiped out all my debts, as a matter of fact. What I saw there, however, certainly wasn't covered in the job description. There were long stretches of time when my crew was monitored by a single guard. We were working overnights, long hours to get the hangar up and running as soon as possible. The government must not have seen the point in assigning a whole team of personnel to babysitting duty. Maybe they were nearby, working on something else. There were certainly other things nearby. 2 nights before our deadline hit, we saw them. The hangar's open side was facing the desert. Any other night, it was like staring into the abyss. When we were lucky, we'd see the faint shimmer of a star. Fortunately for us, we hadn't taken the job for the view. Aside from the occasional smoke break, we didn't step foot outside. This night, those smoke breaks were nearly the death of us. Shane went out to take the first break and came back yelling. He said he saw something walking out there. The guard instructed us to stay put, to get back to work, while he took his flashlight to check the perimeter. He came back empty-handed and warned Shane that one more outburst would get us all canned. Shane kept quiet after that. The guard, however, did not. Seemingly at random, just an hour or two later, he snapped his flashlight back on and broke into a sprint. He was running straight into the desert. There was no explanation. A few of us dropped our tools and watched, but none of us called out, especially not Shane. We watched his bobbing flashlight until he got so far that even it faded into the night. There was no chance we went back to work, not after that. Instead, we approached the open doorway. We swung a few of our spotlights around to get a better look at the landscape. It didn't help. We still didn't call out, but we were watching for any signs of our government-approved babysitter. When 15 minutes passed, we started to chatter. We asked Shane to describe what he saw again. He said a naked man walking with a hunched back and hanging limbs. One of us remarked that we were dealing with a zombie. I don't remember who said it, but honestly, a zombie would have been easier. Another few moments passed and Shane spoke again. This time he pointed for our eyes to follow, and our gazes all landed on the silhouette of the guard. He was finally lumbering back to the hangar. His back was hunched. His arms were hanging. As his silhouette entered the glow of the spotlight, I noticed something weird. I don't know how many of the other guys saw it. We didn't ask after the job was over. The details of his uniform, the buttoned breast pocket and the name tag, were sliding into place. It was as if his attire was being sculpted out of clay. By the time the light was fully on him, he looked the same as before. But I knew what I saw, and Shane recognized his gait. Shane lifted a floor scraper like a broom with a flat metal head and held it out like a spear. He shouted for the guard to stay back. To everyone's surprise, the guard did exactly that. The thing knew it was caught, I realized. It knew it was caught and it wasn't looking for a fight. Then, with the rest of us watching, it just started to change. Its skin and wardrobe slipped and shimmered, like cement being mixed in a bucket. It changed color too, every part of it. The light hue of its skin and the dark hue of its uniform faded to the same beige as the sand beneath its feet. It was blending into the desert, camouflaging itself like a chameleon. The process didn't last more than a few minutes. It vanished right before our eyes. We tried to watch for footprints in the dirt. There weren't any, not after it disappeared or before. It didn't feel real at the time. It doesn't feel real now. Honestly, I guess that's why we went back to work. We resumed the night as usual, although our eyes kept jumping to the door. To the night, to the space in the distance where the shape of the guard had first returned. Whatever it was, it didn't come back. And we finished the job early. Our employers were glad to hear us insist that we didn't see anything that night. They wanted to forget it as much as we did, and they didn't want word to get out. If it wasn't for this one thought, I guess the encounter would be pushed from my mind entirely. If it did want to come back, how would I know where it was? How would I know who it was? I was working at a wildlife preserve in northern Minnesota. We were working on a project to track the population of fishers in the area. Unfortunately, they had been nearly wiped out in the area several years back, and we were making an attempt to reestablish a breeding population. Fishers are problematic to study. They are solitary animals and are difficult to track, trap, and collar. Imagine a ferret on steroids with the personality of a wolverine. This project led me into some pretty remote wilderness areas, oftentimes alone. This was one of those times. It was the dead of winter. I had a few live traps set up in areas where we had caught fishers on game camera. Like I said, They are difficult to trap, so I wasn't hopeful to find anything. Still, I had to check them in case something was in there. The trail to get to the traps required a snowmobile to make it through. There were 3 traps to check, 2 in a forest and 1 I had to cross a frozen bog to get to. Luckily, the budget for this preserve didn't allow for one of those nice new snowmobiles, and I was stuck with a machine from the late 70s. I say luckily because this thing was much lighter than the newer sleds, and honestly, that is the only reason I felt comfortable taking it over the bog. I checked the traps in the forest first and found nothing in one and a raccoon in the other. I released the raccoon and headed towards the bog. I had to drive out of the forest across a prairie area and then down a steep hill to the bog. There was a river running through the area that typically froze in the winter, but I didn't have to cross it. As soon as I got into the prairie, I felt like something was wrong. I couldn't say just what it was, even looking back, but I just knew. I pushed the feeling to the back of my mind and continued on. I did want to turn around, but I couldn't leave the trap without checking to see if something was stuck in there. I knew I reached the bog when I saw the green reeds poking out of the snow. They were the only bit of color in the entire landscape. Everything else was covered in ice and snow. I stopped the sled near the trap. I didn't see anything inside, but I smelled something absolutely rotten. We use chicken livers for the traps. They are stinky and the fishers like them, but they don't smell this bad. No, there was something else. I didn't see any animal carcasses near me. In fact, there were no signs of animals at all. Usually when I drive in with the snowmobile, everything on 4 legs scatters, but there are usually tracks all over if you look around. There was nothing. The only tracks I found were mine from when I set the trap the day before yesterday. I was just about to get on my snowmobile and go, but then out of the corner of my eye, I saw a set of elk antlers poking out of the snow. They were less than 20 yards away from my sled. We do have elk up here in northern Minnesota, but they are rare. This looked to be shed antlers or a skull. It didn't jump up and leave when I came in with the snowmobile, so I assumed it was dead. A set of elk antlers is a pretty neat find, and I wanted to bring them back to the station, but when I approached, the rotting smell overpowered me. Normally, an animal carcass won't stink like that during the winter. That should have been my first sign to get out of there, but I decided to investigate further. I really wanted to take those antlers home. As I began to approach what I thought was an elk carcass, something moved beneath the snow. I stepped backwards as soon as I saw it move, but it was tough to move quickly through all the snow. The creature was slow to rise up from the ground. It moved like it was aged. Its bones clicked and popped. It was emaciated at best. In fact, I was surprised it was still alive from the state its body was in. It had its back to me when it got up, so I hadn't seen its face yet. Its fur was as white as the snow. I figured it must be some sort of albinism mutation. I got back to my sled and started it up. The elk was close enough that I wanted to put some distance between us in case it decided to charge. This is when it turned around, and I can't tell you how terrified I was. The creature had fur all over its body except for its face. The skin was stripped from its skull. It was just bone. I couldn't see any eyes in the dark sockets, but when it turned to look at me, I knew it saw me, eyes or not. I didn't see a lower jaw. I don't think it had one. There was a flap of pinkish meat hanging down from its throat. That must have been its tongue. I was so afraid I was struggling to grasp the pull cord on the snowmobile. It took 3 tries to get it started. All the while, the creature was fixated on me. It began walking towards me. Its movements were jarring, like its legs were not connected to the rest of its body. It's difficult to describe. I got the snowmobile running before it reached me, and I sped off. I kept looking back over my shoulder, but it didn't attempt to chase me. I know what I saw wasn't just some sick or diseased elk. The natives up here have a name for it, but I won't say it here. The legends say they are a danger to humans, and I'm lucky to have escaped as easily as I did. I think I woke the beast from a deep sleep, and that must have been why it didn't try to chase me. I don't really know, but I do know that won't go back into that area alone or without a gun. Joining the Coast Guard had been one of my dreams ever since I was a teenager. So as soon as high school was over, I enlisted. I was stationed on the northern Oregon coast in the Tillamook Bay area. When I think about it, I was so young and energetic back then. I couldn't think of anything I'd rather be doing as a young person. But of course, I enjoyed my downtime too. When I'd get a weekend off, I liked to explore the area. I wasn't from Oregon, so everything there was all new to me. One weekend, a group of us decided to check out a beach that some had never been to. There were 4 of us that night, 2 guys and 2 girls. We weren't exactly couples. We were just hanging out. We got to the beach and made a small bonfire, which I'm not even sure if we were allowed to do, and planned to camp or really just stay out all night, out near some dunes. It was chilly that night, but the fire felt great. It was kind of an out-of-the-way spot, so we anticipated that we wouldn't see many people. And hopefully, no one at all. That night turned out to be quite dark, too. There were a few houses a little way off, but they had their lights out, and all you could see were 2 street lamps in the distance. We'd been sitting out there for hours when the other couple went to get more blankets from the car. It was parked just on the other side of a sand dune, so a bit out of sight. It was probably about 3 in the morning at the time. I was lying next to the fire on a sleeping bag I had brought when I heard a high-pitched yelping noise that seemed to be getting progressively louder. It turned into this screech that really sounded alarming. We thought it must be an animal, but then it started sounding more human-like. Then the 2 of us at the fire jumped up, thinking maybe it was our friends at the car. We sprinted toward them and intercepted them at the sand dune, just as they were heading back to us. They had heard the screeching noise too and thought maybe one of us had been hurt. We could still hear the noises coming from the direction of some nearby trees and debated how smart it would be to check it out. We tried to pinpoint where the scream was coming from, but it was hard to tell to exact direction. It seemed to be coming from every direction, and the sound of the ocean wasn't helping much. Not to mention the darkness. We made our way back to the campsite once the screeching had stopped. But we didn't use our lights because we didn't want to identify our position. We only got a few yards along when we heard a deep cough. We all stopped. It was impossible to see anything, but we could hear shuffling noises too. We stayed hidden in the brush until we heard what sounded like dragging, as if something heavy was being pulled across the surface of the sand. At this point, my imagination was going wild at what might be happening out in the darkness in front of me. We heard the cough again, and at that point I was getting a strong urge to run. We were about to turn around when all of a sudden, this huge beast appeared between 2 of the trees. It sure wasn't anything normal. It stood upright and was between 7 and 8 feet tall. At that point, I went ahead and turned on my tactical flashlight. I needed to have some idea of what we were dealing with. It was covered with reddish-brown hair and looked to be soaking wet. It looked like a giant, like a Neanderthal or something. We stopped and just stared at it. It had a heavy brow ridge and pronounced lips. It had beady black eyes and was staring toward us, even though my light must have been blinding it. It had hold of a large animal, which I could only think was probably the dragging sound we heard. From what I could tell, it appeared to be a dead sea lion. Presumably, this huge creature had been out in the ocean, hunting. When I shined my light on it, it started bellowing. At that point, we all simultaneously turned around and hightailed it out of there as fast as we could. We got in the car and drove up the road toward where the few houses and streetlights were and just sat there under the light. We figured if we were near streetlights, we could see that thing coming if it was inclined to follow us. We were scared, and we just kept throwing out theories as to what it could have been. Honestly, the closest we could agree on was that it resembled what we imagined a Bigfoot to look like. But all of us had the same thinking. How could that be? Because even though Bigfoot hadn't been proven, we've only ever heard of it in the depths of the forest. It seemed crazy to think that we might have spotted one that had just been out hunting in the ocean. We stayed in the car until sunrise. It was already like 4 in the morning anyway, so it was only for an hour or two. The entire time we kept a lookout for any sign of movement, any sign that it was nearby. At the crack of daylight, we headed back to the beach to make sure the fire was out, then continued out of there. I did feel obligated to report it to my chief petty officer. He asked quite a few questions, and I gave him all the details I could remember. His reaction was fairly low-key, and it was hard for me to tell what he really thought, but I figured I had done my duty, and they could now make their own determination as to if an investigation was necessary. I did keep a close eye on the news for any reports for a while afterward, but nothing ever came up. I worked the front desk at a small-town medical clinic in western Maryland. Most of our patients are locals who sprain the occasional ankle or smash a thumb with a hammer. We hardly get any outsiders in town. The few who do are typically going to or coming from the nearby Savage River State Forest. I usually work the day shift from 8 a.m. 6 p.m., but the overnight girl had just gotten married, and her new husband were on a honeymoon for 2 weeks. Lucky her. The clinic asked me to cover her shift, and since I didn't really have any good reasons not to, I agreed. The clinic was run by a doctor who lived in an attached home to the clinic. If there was ever a real emergency, we were instructed to call her into the clinic. Otherwise, the patient could see one of the few nurses who were on the payroll. Usually, there were only 4 or 5 people in the clinic at a time, and only 2 at night. I had never actually had to call the doctor in for an emergency until the other night. This night had been as quiet as the rest of them. It was only me and one of the nurses who was hanging out with me at the desk. She was watching something on her phone, some weird show about people getting married at first sight or something, when someone burst through the front door. It was 2 Maryland state troopers, and between them they were dragging a man who was bleeding profusely from multiple wounds across his body. I was too stunned to say anything, but the nurse who was with me was both rushing to help the officers and reprimanding them for dragging this poor guy in like this. As the 3 of them carried the man into the back, the nurse told me that I needed to call the doctor right away. I was a little nervous at this. The doctor was always nice enough to me, but something about her always made me feel a little intimidated. I knew she had spent 6 years in the Army, and there was even an office rumor that she was still connected to the military. I called her number twice and received no answer. I could hear commotion coming from the others in the back, so I threw my jacket on and ran outside and next door to the doctor's house. I banged on the door sharply and was caught when the door opened almost immediately. The doctor was there, fully dressed and ready to go. She hardly greeted me as she walked past me, heading straight to the clinic. So I just followed her back next door and into the waiting room of the clinic. The doctor immediately walked to the back of the clinic, and I went to one of the supply rooms to try to find something to clean up the blood near the front door. I found some gloves and disinfectant and was scrubbing hard when the doctor walked back in about 2 minutes later. When she saw me cleaning the blood, she told me to stop immediately and leave it alone, that she would take care of it herself later. I started to protest the idea of the doctor cleaning up the mess to be absurd, but before I could say so, she held up her hand to stop me. I remember what she said next, with chilling clarity. "Lock the door," she said. "Lock it, turn off all the lights in the front room, and get behind the desk, out of sight. If anybody comes to the door, you are not to let them in. Not for any reason. Do you understand me?" I guess I must have shown some sign of agreement, because after that she just turned on her heels and returned to the back room. I was absolutely dumbfounded. I had no idea what she was talking about or why she would say any of that stuff. I was pretty unnerved at this point. I ran around turning off the lights and locking the deadbolt on the front door. I ran behind the desk and crawled under. My heart was racing, and it was hard to keep my breathing steady. The clinic really wasn't big, but I hadn't seen the nurse or either of the officers since they took the injured guy into the back room. I sat for what felt like an hour under the desk when a sudden banging on the front door scared the crap out of me. I almost got up to see who it was until I remembered what the doctor had said. I thought about peeking over the counter to see who it was, but thought better of it. And honestly, I was too afraid to look anyway. At first, it seemed like the banging was coming from a single person, but after a few moments, it sounded like two, then three, until ultimately it sounded like half the town was out here just banging on the glass doors. I was terrified at this point, sitting crouched down with my head tucked between my legs. There were no voices or demands to be let inside, just rapid, rhythmic banging. Nobody from the back came out front, and I sat alone in the receptionist room, waiting for the thunderous pounding at the door to break the glass. I can't tell you how long it went on for. At one point, I was certain I was losing my sanity when it suddenly just stopped. One moment it was absolute turmoil, and the next, just complete silence. The new stillness was more unsettling than the pounding had been. Only a few minutes later, there was another knock on the door, and I felt a pang of fear, thinking that whatever was out there had returned. But this time, I could hear voices on the other side of the door. I was working up the courage to actually look this time when the doctor came bounding down the hallway to the front door. She unlocked it and threw it open. A stream of men rushed in, probably a dozen, all dressed in a type of military uniform I couldn't recognize. A few we carrying what looked like medical instruments, while others were carrying assault rifles. It was chaotic, and I found myself being gently escorted outside and to the back of a black SUV. Two men sat in the front seat, and another sat next to me in the back, all dressed in the same military fatigues I had seen the other men wearing. The man sitting next to me in the back asked me to explain the night's events, and I did. At least the parts I could anyway. He asked me a few questions, mostly about the pounding noise I heard. I could tell he was trying to hide it, but when I told him it sounded like literally dozens of people, he became very concerned, almost frightened. When I was done, he thanked me politely and told the man at the wheel to drive me home, and he did. I never gave them my address, but they knew where my house was anyway. The next day, I received a visit at home from the man who had questioned me. He told me that the injured man had contracted a rare and infectious disease, and that everyone who had come into physical contact with him needed to be quarantined. The pounding I heard was a delusion brought on my stress, and that I would soon receive a call from someone with the depth of health, with information on my indefinite paid leave of absence. And that's it. I haven't seen the doctor, the nurse, the injured man, or the officer since. And just like the man had said, I received a call from someone who claimed to be from the Department of Health. I've been placed on an indefinite leave of absence with full pay, the only restriction being that I don't discuss the incident with anyone. We were about to turn around when all of a sudden, this huge beast appeared between two of the trees. It sure wasn't anything normal. It stood upright and was between 7 and 8 feet tall. At that point, I went ahead and turned on my tactical flashlight. I needed to have some idea of what we were dealing with. It was covered with reddish-brown hair and looked to be soaking wet. It looked like a giant, like a Neanderthal or something. We stopped and just stared at it. It had a heavy brow ridge and pronounced lips. It had beady black eyes and was staring toward us, even though my light must have been blinding it. It had hold of a large animal, which I could only think was probably the dragging sound we heard. From what I could tell, it appeared to be a dead sea lion. Presumably, this huge creature had been out in the ocean, hunting. When I shined my light on it, it started bellowing. At that point, we all simultaneously turned around and hightailed it out of there as fast as we could. We got in the car and drove up the road toward where the few houses and streetlights were and just sat there under the light. We figured if we were near streetlights, we could see that thing coming if it was inclined to follow us. We were scared, and we just kept throwing out theories as to what it could have been. Honestly, the closest we could agree on was that it resembled what we imagined a Bigfoot to look like. But all of us had the same thinking. How could that be? Because even though Bigfoot hadn't been proven, we've only ever heard of it in the depths of the forest. It seemed crazy to think that we might have spotted one that had just been out hunting in the ocean. We stayed in the car until sunrise. It was already like 4 in the morning anyway, so it was only for an hour or two. The entire time we kept a lookout for any sign of movement, any sign that it was nearby. At the crack of daylight, we headed back to the beach to make sure the fire was out, then continued out of there. I did feel obligated to report it to my chief petty officer. He asked quite a few questions, and I gave him all the details I could remember. His reaction was fairly low-key, and it was hard for me to tell what he really thought, but I figured I had done my duty, and they could now make their own determination as to if an investigation was necessary. I did keep a close eye on the news for any reports for a while afterward, but nothing ever came up. When was the last time you looked at Mars? A year ago, my answer would have been, basically never. Now I look at it almost every day. I can't help myself. Specifically, I'm looking at its moon, Phobos. And then, sometime last year, I learned about the monolith on Mars. If you haven't heard about it, check it out. It's a real thing. In all of the reports I've found, government bodies try to minimize its significance. They either describe it as far smaller than it really is, or they describe the perfectly rectangular object as a naturally occurring phenomenon. I know there's nothing natural about it. I've seen the pictures. I've done the math. The structure is over a mile long. How many straight lines have you seen in nature that cover that kind of distance? Around that time, when the monolith was first brought to my attention, I started asking the exact questions that Buzz Aldrin himself pondered. Who put it there? And where are they? That's what I was trying to answer. In 1960, the Special Space Advisor to the President suggested that Mars's moon Phobos was actually a satellite launched long ago by an advanced Martian race. Martians might not exist in the capacity that 80s sci-fi movies once thought, but the monolith does at least suggest that some form of life was modifying the surface of Phobos. I wanted to see what else was changing. I didn't hear about the structures beneath the surface until recently, until after my research got scary. Whatever's lurking below the surface of Phobos, I haven't seen it, but I did see something else, and something saw me too. The Phobos images are available to the public. Look up the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and you'll find them. I wasn't satisfied with those photos, though. Mars was at its most visible last December. I used a Celestron to get the best view possible. I thought, if I couldn't study Phobos for a night, at least I could study the surface of its planet. What I captured was unremarkable. I didn't see a little green man waving back at me, if that's what you're expecting. I was disheartened by my discovery, or lack thereof. That night, as I lay in bed, the house shook. A loud siren pulled me out from underneath my covers. I thought I was experiencing an earthquake. None of my neighbors felt it. When it happened again the next night, I knew something was targeting me. I didn't consider that it was related to Phobos. Then I found the monolith. I found a replica of it anyway. On the second night, I discovered that the wooden chairs that completed my dining room set had been broken. They were reassembled on the floor into an upright rectangle. I knocked it over in my panic. The house shook again on the third night. This time the siren was accompanied by a bright red light shining in through my windows. I found my couch standing on end, another rectangular pillar, another monolith. I left that time. I wasn't going to stick around to be harassed, especially after my neighbors had denied seeing or feeling anything both times that I asked. I found a hotel and figured I'd be safe there. I wasn't. Have you ever been in the forest and suddenly out of nowhere something feels unexplainably wrong? You can't see anything out of the ordinary, but you just know. Like you shouldn't be there. Like the forest itself is telling you to leave. I'm here to tell you, if you're ever out in the wilderness and you feel that feeling, that overwhelming sense of dread, get out as fast as you can. Because I didn't, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was driving to check on my uncle's cabin. It was located deep in the woods. To access it with a vehicle, you had to drive down an old logging road that seemed to just get narrower and narrower until you weren't sure your car would even fit. The cabin was on the water. The easier way to get there was via boat, but I never much liked boats. Even the 20-minute ride from the other side of the river sent me into a panic. So here I was, driving down this narrow road that was overgrown with weeds and young saplings. My uncle had just bought a house down south and wanted to sell the cabin. I thought it was a strange and sudden decision, as that cabin was his pride and joy for as long as I knew him. He built it himself, so it was a shock to me that he was going to sell. Physically, he was still in good shape and was able to do all the maintenance on the property, but he said he just wanted to move on and left it at that. He kept saying he was going to get it ready, but he just never did. Both me and my dad offered to help him, but he told us to stay away from that house. Those were the words he used. Stay away from that house. After my uncle left his cabin, things started getting weird. He started talking about all sorts of crazy things like aliens and stuff. You couldn't have a normal conversation with him. The empty cabin was the least of his worries, and we all sort of forgot about it. After a particularly bad storm in the area, my grandma asked me to go take a look around the cabin and make sure nothing had been damaged. I arrived at the property, and as soon as I stepped out of the car, I knew there was something terribly wrong. There wasn't any storm damage that I could see, but something wasn't right. It was that feeling you get in the back of your mind, telling you to leave. Whatever the situation, just leave. I wasn't going to stay long. That's how I justified ignoring the feeling. It was a long drive from town because I flat out refused to take the boat, so it was getting dark by the time I arrived. I planned to just take a quick look around and drive home again. I unlocked the door with the spare key my uncle kept underneath a rock by the entryway. The inside of the cabin was in shambles. There were papers strewn about everywhere. It was just a mess. I had never known him to keep his home like this, but then again, he seemed to develop some sort of dementia in the last few months, so I didn't know quite what to think. I got caught up reading some of the papers that were lying on the kitchen counter. They talked about monsters that lived in the woods and ways to kill them. It was insane. Suddenly I heard a tap on the window. I jumped up to look outside. I guess the scary stories were getting to me. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary out there, so I figured it must have been a bird or a bug flying into the glass. But as soon as I sat back down, I heard it again. I got up again, and that time it was dark out. Just a few moments ago, I saw the sunset across the horizon, but now it was nearly pitch black. I heard the tapping again, but this time it was coming from the front door. I just knew. I knew something was out there. I ran to the door and bolted it shut. I couldn't see anything through the windows, but whatever was out there could definitely see me. There was tapping and scraping at nearly all the windows now. I went around the cabin and closed the blinds on every window, trying to make sure whatever was out there couldn't see in. I remembered reading that the monsters from the papers were attracted to lights, so I darkened the house. And then the tapping stopped. I knew then that my uncle wasn't crazy, and I knew why he didn't want to come back here. I could see my car parked out in the driveway. I desperately wanted to get to it and drive the hell away from here, but I didn't want to take the chance not knowing what was outside. I accepted that I would spend the night locked in this house, but I wanted to get a look at what exactly was out there. I had my car keys with me. If they were truly attracted to the light, then this was how I would get a look at them. I hit the lock button and the headlights turned on. All of a sudden, a dozen of these creatures came out of the forest and swarmed my car. They looked sort of human, but just sort of... They were pale and bald with large eyes. They looked like they had the ability to walk upright if they wanted to, but all of the ones I saw crawled on the ground. They were fascinated by my car. I hit the horn button and it caused them to scatter, but only for a moment. As soon as it was quiet, they moved back in until the headlights shut off. They stayed away from the house as long as I kept the blinds closed and the lights out. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up reading the information my uncle had found about these creatures. I had to read under a blanket to avoid drawing them in. I couldn't find out how to get rid of them. Obviously, my uncle couldn't either. They were gone by daybreak, and so was I. The cabin still sits alone in the forest. My uncle still owns it and has no intention of doing anything with it. He said, "Let the forest have it," and after what I saw, I agree with him. I'm sure you've heard that all of us have a doppelganger somewhere in the world. That's something that has been told to me at least a dozen times in my life. It's always said by someone who seems to have a little bit of scientific basis for the claim, but is never presented as a fact with any kind of proof or sources. You've probably also heard from people who claim to have met their doppelganger, or maybe you've even seen yours. So, with that in mind, what I'm about to tell you will probably seem underwhelming at first, but I promise this was more than a doppelganger. This was some cross-dimension weirdness that I have never been able to wrap my head around. In August of 1996, I was a 10-year-old kid with a 13-year-old brother and a 6-year-old sister. Our dad had died earlier in the summer in a car accident. He had been on his way to the store for my mom, who had forgotten to buy milk during the weekly grocery trip that morning. Mom had a really hard time with it. Not only with losing Dad, but also she blamed herself for it, even though it wasn't her fault at all. As a result of blaming herself, she had slipped into a depressed funk. My older brother had been doing most of the parenting for the last couple of months, even though he was barely a teenager. And each of us was grieving in our own way, so we were a very different family than we had been just months earlier. At the time of Dad's death, we were planning a family trip to Disney World. Mom was committed to taking us still, even in her weakened emotional state, because it was something Dad had been looking forward to. So in August, as planned, we got in the car and took the drive down to Orlando from Atlanta, where we live. It would be about a 7-hour drive. The day we got to Disney started out seemingly normal for a day at Disney. We went on rides, saw the sights, and just generally enjoyed ourselves as much as possible. It wasn't until the haunted house ride that things started to get a little strange. That ride was surprisingly sentimental, and after watching the ghosts, still in love and dancing through the walls with the loves of their lives, Mom needed a moment to herself. She took a seat at a food station and sent me and my brother to take our little sister to meet Minnie Mouse, who was scheduled to make an appearance shortly at one of the photo tents. We were waiting in line when suddenly we heard someone call out our names, a male voice. It sounded just like our dad. We turned and looked, and there he was, our father, frantically scanning the crowd to find us. All of us froze stiff. We didn't know what we were looking at, but we knew we could all see it and that we weren't just imagining it. I asked my brother, "Is that Dad?" And he just shook his head and said, "Can't be." But it was. He saw us and started walking toward us. My little sister ran over and jumped up in his arms, crying and hugging him. He was comforting her, saying it was okay, that he knows it's scary to be lost, but he was right there the whole time. I looked at my brother and he looked at me, and we both knew that something very weird and potentially dangerous was going on. He ran over and grabbed her out of the dad lookalike's arms. I ran with him, and we all took off as fast as we could back to where we'd left Mom. The guy took off after us, chasing us the whole way. When we got to Mom, she stood up in a hurry asking what we were so scared of. I guess she could see the fear on our faces. My sister was crying, beating on my brother's back the whole time he ran with her, screaming for him to let her down because she wanted Daddy. So, when we got to Mom, my sister was screaming, "I want Daddy," over and over again. Mom thought the haunted house had bothered her too. She took my sister in her arms and was saying, "Daddy's in heaven. Daddy's in heaven. He can still see us, though." She was trying to comfort her and calm her down, but it wasn't working. My sister pulled back away from Mom and said, "Daddy is right there." She pointed back into the crowd, and Mom looked, and she saw him too. The man that looked like Dad was standing there staring at Mom. His face was white as a sheet, and he was shaking and starting to cry. Mom looked at him with the exact same expression. She said, "Eric," and he looked back at her and said, "Laura?" Both their names were right. Then, at the exact same time, they both shook their heads and said, "You died when you went to get the milk." That's when three kids who looked just like me and my siblings came running through the crowd yelling for their dad. He turned, saw them, and gave us one last glance before he took off and grabbed them, leading them away before they saw us too. We didn't stay at Disney long after that. Mom hurried us out and we went to the beach and then SeaWorld for the rest of the day instead. And we never really talked about what happened that day until earlier this year after cancer took Mom. My brother, sister, and me started talking about the Disney run-in the day after Mom's funeral, and we all have different ideas about what it could have been. My brother thinks it was just a wild coincidence that some people who looked very similar to our family and had at least a couple of the same names and circumstances in their lives just happened to have been there at the same time. My little sister thinks it was a ghost and that the doubles of us were something that we just imagined in order to make sense of it over the years. Personally, I believe that somehow we crossed dimensional paths with ourselves. Maybe it was our own family living in Mom's alternate world of, what if I had gone for the milk that day instead of Dad? What if she'd never felt the need to blame herself for what happened? Would we have still seen the doppelganger or whatever it was? I guess we'll never know for sure. But I do know this. What we saw was very real, and it has affected me every single day since. My grandparents moved down to southern Florida, the Fort Lauderdale area, back in the early 2000s. And as per our family tradition, we spent almost every holiday with them. It was easily enough to ride along when I was a kid, but once I hit college, it became somewhat harder to go down from the Nashville area where I was going to school. It's a pretty straight shot, though, down I-75, but at the very bottom end of the highway down in Florida, the road cuts straight across the state through Big Cypress Preserve and a pretty wild stretch of the Everglades. Even as a kid, it struck me as a strange place to build a highway, but it's undeniably scenic. Sometimes you can even see alligators sunning themselves along the side of the highway. When we were younger and driving down with our parents, my older brother loved to taunt me about all the monsters living out in the swamp, and I used to be petrified by the time we got to our grandparents' house. Meanwhile, Fort Lauderdale isn't exactly known for its creepy, crawly creatures, apart from some massive cockroaches, but that never really did much to calm my nerves. Anyway, during college, I was heading down for Thanksgiving in 2018. I remember specifically because it was the year before Nicole hit, and I didn't make it for the next couple of years after that. I was on my way down and was pushing harder than I should have to make it. Usually I split up the 14-hour drive into 2 days, but I'd stayed in Nashville longer than I had first anticipated. That meant I was over 12 hours in when I was crossing into the National Preserve and admittedly starting to get punchy. If I really pushed, I'd make it by midnight, which I know for a fact my mom was counting on. It was late and the sun had been down so long I felt like I'd been driving in the dark forever. No amount of passenger seat snacks and caffeine could keep me focused. Besides, once you start cutting through the preserves, especially in the dark, everything takes on this super surreal quality. The nights down there can get super muggy, and thick fog can come up in a second and hang around in ways that make any kind of travel dangerous. So I was tearing my hair out because all I wanted to do was floor it and cut across that last hour and a half. Instead, fog had me fighting my way through the cypresses. So yeah, maybe I was going faster than I should have been, but I felt sure I'd be able to see taillights or headlights in time to miss anything major. And then, all of a sudden, something leapt out of the fog less than 50 feet ahead, and I slammed on the brakes. The whole car threatened to go into a spin, and I yanked on the wheel to keep from slamming into the guardrail. It had happened. I was going to hit this thing in the road, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Instinct took on. The first thing I noticed, before seeing anything, was the smell. Not exactly like something dead, but more like an ugly mix of body odor and animal musk. I had to pull the front of my shirt up over my nose to even get close. My heart was pounding because it was definitely shaped like a person. But the more I looked, the less that actually proved to be true. The proportions were super weird, like the arms seemed too long for the body. Plus, it was covered all over with reddish hair like an orangutan, but the legs were too long for it to be that. Everything about it just seemed wrong. That plus the smell and all those stories my brother told when we were kids came rushing up like crazy. I know this sounds nuts, but I'm 1,000% sure this thing was a skunk ape. My hands started shaking and I climbed back into my car to call my dad to tell him what had happened. At that point, I didn't even know what the damage to my car was, and I felt far too rattled to drive right away. As soon as I sat down, though, this inhuman wailing started from off in the fog. Not just one voice, but several. It was impossible to tell where they were coming from, but I knew in an instant that whatever the issues with my car might be, there was no way I was waiting around. Against my better judgment, I kicked on my high beams to make up for the lost headlight and hightailed it out of there, somehow making it to my parents, but with no memory of the drive. When I finally got there, my dad was waiting up for me. I think my dad at first thought I had made it all up to keep from getting in trouble for wrecking the car. But there was no denying it when he saw how upset I was. I had been an officer of the law many years prior to becoming a part of the Railroad Transit Police. I had been working in a large city, and I wanted a change. So we moved to a smaller town, and I got a job patrolling some important and historical railroad tracks in Pennsylvania. It was quite the shift. I didn't have to deal with nearly any of the stuff I had seen in New York. It was much more peaceful. But I'll admit, I was going a little stir-crazy after about a month or two. It was literally just too quiet. My daily duties were pretty simple and were as follows. Don't let anyone get into trouble. It was really rare when I had an occurrence where I needed to really be the enforcer. My wife was pretty pleased with this, but I did miss the action. Staring at railroad tracks was like watching paint dry. Sure, I spent more time at home than at work, but the days felt like they dragged on. I was just waiting for something exciting to happen. Anything. And sure enough, something did. It was a grim, rainy day. Everything was gray, and everything was wet. And I remember thinking, great, another boring day. People would rather stay inside and keep dry than go out on a day like this and stir up trouble. Little did I know that mudslides were not unheard of with areas of the railroad on days like this. And we had plenty of landslide scares that day. My wife was pretty worried. She didn't like the idea of me being around a natural disaster. But I told her that after dealing with some pretty scary people in the city, a landslide would be a piece of cake. I was terribly wrong. To make matters worse with her, I had been stuck at work late. I guess that's what happens when you take your quiet life for granted. I had been finishing up for the night. Many of the emergency disaster help had gone home after cleaning up the mudslides, but I wanted to make sure that everything would be safe and okay for the following day. And I also had a very intricate report to fill out. They were detail-oriented, those small town folk, and everything was still pen and paper. No computer screens. My report took a few hours to fill out, and I figured that before I went home, I'd inspect that same area of railroad. So I went back down to that area. The rain had cleared up, but the whole place felt pretty dreary. There was plenty of fog, which reminded me of some old spook show, and I just remember it hitting me and me thinking, wow, this is really creepy. I don't like this. And that's when I saw something out west, towards some trees. I wasn't used to this many trees and being surrounded by full-on nature. I literally forgot about the possibility of a wild animal roaming about. But when I got to remembering, I'm thinking, it's an elk or deer or something like that. That wouldn't be unusual. The only thing that was unusual was that I could actually hear my thoughts out there. But I got back to business. I'm checking off this list of things. I'm really trying to make sure I've got everything covered. And then I hear something moving around off to the west again. So I stopped. I looked around, and I got to wondering about what would happen if I were face to face with an elk. Would the elk hurt me? I didn't know. I had some bear mace. That would work on an elk if it came down to it. Another officer down towards the office called my phone. He was asking if I was all right. I told him, yeah, I was all right, just checking everything out, but I asked if they'd ever been targeted by an elk. I was pleased to hear when he started to laugh, but then he said, "But be careful of the wildlife." He explained that they could be dangerous, but to just hang on because he was headed in my direction to help me finish up. Something about the other officer's warning made me a little nervous, and the fog is now laying down so thick that I can't really see if it really is an elk or what. Now I'm thinking it could have been a bear or something far more aggressive. So I climbed into my tiny patrol car and hoped that the vehicle would protect me. That's when I realized my car was facing west. I turned on my brights. And you know what? I'm honestly getting goosebumps thinking about it. I saw what I had been sensing. Out west, something large was standing in the fog. I'm telling you, it was huge. I don't think I've ever seen anything that large in my life. Yes, it was tall, but it was also very wide. Its posture reminded me a little of a gorilla's. Its arms were long and thick, just like its chest. I couldn't really see its legs because the fog was dense, and the thing didn't really seem to have a neck. Now it looked like a gorilla's posture, but it didn't look like a gorilla at all. It didn't look like it had hair. It looked kind of bald, really, and gray. It looked like a gorilla man made of rocks. It was wild. Between the distance and the fog, it was a bit obscured, and it took off into the trees the moment I turned those brights on. By the time the other officer came, I was shaking. He didn't know what I was talking about. He guessed that maybe I'd seen a bear, but it wasn't a bear. There's no way in hell that was a bear. And I still haven't told my wife. Okay, I really don't remember much, but I'll try to give you as many details as possible. It was just such a surreal experience that I second-guessed myself on almost everything. At this point, I've probably gone over it a million times in my head, trying to figure out if I even believe myself. I've decided that I do believe what happened, and that's why I'm passing my story on to you now. I guess here's why I think that it's actually real. I don't drink, I don't do drugs, and I don't watch scary movies. I have a strong mind, and I trust my senses. And for that reason, I really do think that what I saw was real. But it's hard to not second-guess yourself when you experience something so out of the ordinary. So my wife and I were driving back from the movies. It was really late because we'd gone to the drive-in. They don't start until the sun sets, and we stayed for the second movie, the double feature. So, since we did that, we weren't on our way back home until after midnight. Also, the drive-in theater was about an hour from our house, so it was going to be very late by the time we got home. Most of the drive was on the highway, but there was some back roads driving. And they truly were back roads through dark woods areas. There were no street lights, no house lights, not even light from the night sky. It was overcast, and the only real light was from our headlights. That, I believe, is why the other light stood out so clearly. It's really the thing that I remember the clearest. It has stood out the most in my mind as I have gone over the details of the encounter over and over in my head. We didn't see the light head on. I actually noticed it in my rearview mirror. It was weird to see in the rearview mirror because the light was red. So I knew right away that it wasn't like the headlights of another car coming up behind us. It was red and fairly small, and it also seemed very, very stationary. It sat in the lower right-hand corner of my mirror and didn't really move at all. The light was visible in the mirror for probably 2 minutes. We were just driving along, and it stayed in that lower corner the whole time. Then when we went around a bend in the road, the light disappeared momentarily. I wondered if maybe it was an emergency vehicle or some other vehicle out of the ordinary, and we just couldn't hear its siren. But then when we were back on a straight section of road, the light appeared again in our mirror. This time it was bigger, which made me instantly think that whatever the light belonged to was closer to us. I thought all this was weird, but not like scary, yet. It started to get scary really quickly after that. Over the course of just a few seconds, the light began to grow noticeably bigger, still in the rearview mirror. It was illuminating the warning notification that was now popping up on my mirrors, which was beginning to make me very uneasy. You know, the objects in mirror are closer than they appear message. The red orb was gaining on us very quickly, until suddenly it seemed like it was right behind us. I could now see its glow casting shadows on my dashboard. My heart was hammering at this point. I wanted to speed up and drive away as fast as possible, but the road was windy and I was afraid of going off the road into the ditch. Obviously, my wife was seeing all of this too, and she was also starting to freak out. The thought of a carjacking entered both of our heads. She was begging me to go faster, which I was trying my best without losing control on the dark roads. She was clutching my arm in fear so hard that it hurt. I dared to quickly turn around to get a better view, and I could see it. The red orb was right behind us, probably only 10 feet from our bumper. And that's where my memory of this whole thing stops. Next thing I knew, my wife and I were sitting in our car, but we were pulled over and parked along the side of the road. We were both upright in our seats with our seatbelts on. I had both hands on the steering wheel. And the strangest thing of all, the sun was rising. I don't know what happened, but I do know that I was absolutely terrified, and so was my wife. I remember her screaming my name, begging me to drive faster. I remember how tightly I gripped the steering wheel. I remember how I could barely keep my eyes on the road ahead of me, trying to watch whatever awful thing was coming up behind me in the rearview mirror, and then nothing until we were parked looking at the sun. My wife suggested we drove through some strange chemical field, maybe led off by a local farmer, but of course that didn't really seem plausible. But our minds were trying to come with everything. Were we so tired that we just decided to pull over and get some sleep? That didn't make sense for so many reasons, including how could we have both have had the same dream? And who sleeps with their seatbelt on, gripping the steering wheel? No, that explanation doesn't make any sense to me. I think that something happened that we don't remember. Whatever the red orb was, it was trying to catch us or overtake us. And I think it did catch us, and something happened that we can't remember. And that's really scary. Like I said, I have questioned this experience a lot. I've tried to figure out any logical explanation, but I can't. There is just no way my wife and I had the exact same dream. Up until this point, I've just thought about it and talked about it with my wife. Now that I'm writing it down, it really seems extra real. I am 100% sure that something strange and unnatural or supernatural happened to us that night. In the mid-2000s, I decided to join the Army. I guess at the time I thought it would be some kind of grand adventure. I managed to make it through basic training and advanced individual training. I'm not going to lie, though, it really kicked my butt, but I managed to get through it and got sent to my first duty station. I was at the National Training Center for pre-deployment training. I was issued supplies and a room and tried to get myself settled in. But it wasn't an easy transition, and I felt uncomfortable there. The place just didn't seem right to me. I got into my room and the first few nights were just strange. There was a weird energy there, and bizarre stuff kept happening. For example, my gear kept getting moved around. I'd find my things in the most random places. Also, the lights would often turn themselves on in the middle of the night, and I kept hearing weird groaning noises, stuff like that. I'd been there alone those first days, but my roommate showed up at the end of the week. We had known each other during basic training, so it was nice to have somebody familiar around. I told him I felt like someone was messing with me and warned him to watch his stuff. The first night he was there, we secured our room and belongings and went to sleep. We had to be up at 5:30 for physical training. But at around 1 in the morning, I woke up because my blanket had fallen off the bed. I was freezing, which was bizarre because we were in the South, and it was the summer, so It's always hot. I got down to get my blanket and glanced over to notice my wardrobe doors were open. I went and closed them and got back into bed. I fell asleep again, but not much later something woke me up again. I sat up and now saw that all my stuff and also my roommate's stuff had been tossed around the room. I woke up my roommate and he was really irritated. We got our stuff picked up and went back to bed. But I got woken up yet again, and now it felt like we weren't alone. I could hear my roommate snoring, so I knew he was in his bed, where he should be. That's when I saw that the light from the fridge in the kitchenette was shining into the room. I could also see that someone had the fridge door open and was looking inside. It was a soldier. And now I was freezing again. I was about to call out to the soldier, but that's when I watched as he turned around. It took a minute for my eyes to adjust to the light, and then I started recognizing the gear he had on. He was loaded up with combat gear and was wearing fatigues and boots. He looked ready for war. When I looked at his face, he turned to face the other direction, and I was shocked at what I saw. Half his head and helmet were gone, like they had been blown off. I was petrified at that point, but I watched as he closed the fridge and walked across the room to the door and walked out. I was at a complete loss for words. Obviously, that couldn't have been real. I knew it was a dream. But my mind was racing, and I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't even wake my roommate up. It was all too bizarre. I showed up to PT, and the acting first sergeant could tell I wasn't myself. He actually said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost broke my concentration and told him what had happened, but I contained myself and told him I was fine. But about halfway through PT, he came up to me again and asked me what was going on. I guess I wasn't hiding it as well as I thought it was. I told him I just hadn't been able to sleep that night. But after PT ended, he pulled me out and said I should just speak up and whatever I said would be off the record. I told him that if I told him what happened, he would think I was crazy. He told me again that I should trust him and assured me it would be off the record. I started telling him what happened, but when I got to the part about the soldier's head being half blown off, he got really pale and quiet. He said, "Who put you up to this? Do you think this is funny?" For some reason, he was really put off by my story, and my impression was that he thought I was trying to put one over on him. But I had no idea what he was talking about. Put me up to this? I swore to him that I wasn't lying, and that I had seen this apparition, and it had completely freaked me out. Then he told me to follow him. He took me to the command office where I'd never been. He unlocked a door in the back, and I followed him into a room where the commander's desk was. There were some portraits on the wall, and he pointed to one. It immediately gave me the chills. Plain as day, I was looking at a portrait of the soldier I had seen. I just said, "That's him." The sergeant told me who it was. He was a corporal in the unit's first deployment to Iraq. He had died in an IED attack that took off part of his head. Apparently, I was the first soldier to be assigned the room I was in since it had belonged to the deceased corporal. I was just floored and didn't know what to say. The sergeant then told me stories about who the soldier was and how well-liked he had been. I think at that moment I completely realized how tragic war really is. I deployed with that unit a couple months later and spent a year fighting in that horrible place. I had some really close calls, and each one of them always made me think of that corporal. I survived more things than most people can imagine, and obviously I managed to make it home, but I don't take anything for granted anymore. I just returned home from what should have been a romantic weekend getaway with my wife in upstate New York, but it was anything but that. We're coming up on our 3rd wedding anniversary, and as a gift, I decided to surprise her with a weekend trip up to Lake George. Since it's not exactly tourist season, I got a sick deal on a beautiful cabin for 3 nights. It was actually built on one of the small islands dotting the lake, and we would have to take a short boat ride to get to it. My wife was totally surprised, and after we tied up the boat to the small dock on the shore, we got to exploring. The island itself was small, a few hundred yards wide at best. The cabin was spacious, though. It had an old rustic charm. Artwork of the lake and surrounding area lined the walls. We had gotten here just as it started to get dark, and after a quick dinner, we called it an early night, beat after the long car drive and boat ride. The next morning, I woke up early, before my wife. I made a pot of coffee and stepped outside. Enjoying the brisk air, I took a walk down to the shoreline to check on the boat and make sure it was still securely tied. That's when I noticed something odd. The ground around the little dock was soggy from the constant lapping of the small, gentle waves. Around the boat, there were strange footprints embedded in the dirt. They weren't from a shoe. They were narrow and elongated, what looked like a set of 4 thin toes jutting out from a shallow heel. No animal came to mind, but then again, I'm not much of a naturist. I chalked it up to some kind of local fauna I wasn't familiar with and returned to the cabin to wake my wife up to enjoy some breakfast and a day out on the lake. We took the boat out for a while. It wasn't particularly cold, so we stayed out a bit longer than planned. When we returned to the cabin, we grilled some steaks, and after dinner we decided to have another cup of coffee and sit out on the chair swing beside the house. It was comfortable, and we were warm under piled blankets so naturally, we both fell asleep. I'm not sure what it was that roused me. The first thing I noticed was that it had gotten much colder. Looking over at my poor wife in the dim light, I could see the tip of her nose was red. As I went to shake her awake, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, down towards the water. I felt a pang of panic. Somebody coming out to an island like this probably meant to cause some trouble, and there wasn't any help that would get to us quickly. Our cell phones didn't even have service, and there was no landline. I gently shook my wife as I peered over her shoulder, trying to get a better look at whoever it was. Just as she was coming around, a gust of wind blew the branches overhead, causing an opening for the moonlight to shine down onto the water's edge, and what I saw made me slap my own hand over my mouth so as not to cry out. A pale, thin figure was crawling out of the water onto the beach. It had 2 arms and legs that I could make out, and a head too large for its frail body. It didn't have any eyes as far as I could tell, and I could have sworn I spotted a pair of gills along each side of its throat. My wife was waking up now, and I slapped my free hand over her mouth. This startled her, and I could see an angry flash in her eyes, but the look on my face quickly turned her irritation to concern. I nodded my head in the direction of the creature. She turned to look, and I felt her body go rigid when she caught sight of it. The creature was roaming around slowly now along the shore, seemingly aimless in its plodding. I whispered for my wife to follow me, and we quietly rose from the chair and began slowly stepping back toward the house. In an unfamiliar setting and with full attention on the creature, I accidentally bumped into the grill we had cooked our steaks on earlier. A metal spatula had been resting on top and it fell off, clattering to the floor of the small paved patio the grill rested on. The clang sounded like a gunshot in the silent darkness, and the creature snapped its head in our direction. We both froze, waiting to see what would happen next, but almost immediately the thing opened its mouth and let out a garbled, piercing squeal, like a small child trying to scream while gargling. I grabbed my wife by the arm and pulled her behind me, sprinting towards the house. I guess she had thrown a look over her shoulder as we ran because she let out her own scream of, "It's coming!" I didn't bother to look and instead dashed the last few feet, still clinging to my wife. I threw open the door and nearly tossed my wife inside, coming in just after and slamming the door shut behind me. The door was solid oak, and there were no windows on this wall, but there was a series of small raps at the door followed by another squeal. We both stood frozen, too afraid to make any noise or move. After a few minutes of silence, we heard one last scream further away from the direction of the shoreline, and then that was it. We spent a sleepless night huddled on the couch in complete terror, praying for the sun to rise quickly. As soon as it did, we grabbed our belongings and bolted down to the boat dock. We had the boat loaded and pulled out into the lake in less than 3 minutes. I spent the whole ride back to the main shoreline, waiting for a sickly hand to reach over the gunwale and try to pull one of us overboard, but it never did. We got back to the office and dropped the keys with the clerk, not bothering to explain our early checkout or even ask for a refund. We have no idea what it is we saw that night, and frankly, don't really want to. I just wanted to share my experience with you and warn others that there is something not human living on or in Lake George. I was on the police force in Minnesota for about 12 years. The town I was in was so far north it was basically Canada. Summers were short and humid. Winters were absolutely brutal. In fact, most of the incidents I had to respond to in the winter months were related to bad road conditions in one way or another. This incident happened in the fall of 2010. It was cold, I remember, but there were only a couple of inches of snow on the ground at the time. I was called to investigate a case of property damage at a homestead deep in the woods. The report came in early that morning and said there was significant damage to the woodshed. I asked if it looked like the perpetrator was an animal, in which case it would be a job for animal control instead, but the caller said there were footprints left behind. I cleared my schedule so I could head out there right away. If there were footprints, I could get a size and tread pattern. But I had to move quickly because as soon as the sun came up, it would start to melt the prints and they would get distorted beyond use. The homestead was an off-grid cabin set up deep in a pine forest. You couldn't see it from the road. In fact, you could barely see the driveway. The only reason I found the place was the lone mailbox at the end of the road. I didn't even see a fire number. I'll be honest, the guy who lived there was a bit odd. You must be to live in this type of climate without electricity. He said he spent the last 3 days chopping wood for the winter, as he was a little behind this year. The woodshed was located about 50 yards away from the house. The man claimed to have heard an animal moving around out there for the last 2 days, but he never saw anything. He thought now that it might have been the person who did the damage to the woodshed, but it didn't make much sense as to why someone would have any reason to attack a building. And it looked like an attack, like something you would expect from a bear. One whole side of the shed was torn off and scattered across the ground. Logs from the shed were strewn all over the property, and I mean all over the property. There were logs up near the house and just all over for as far as you could see. The man said he woke up in the night to the sound of the destruction outside, and he opened his door to take a look at what was going on. He claimed to have seen the back of a man who looked to be dressed in a white fur coat. As soon as he opened the door, he said the man ran into the woods. He waited until morning to investigate the damage, and that's when he found the footprints. But here's the strange part. The prints were that of bare feet. I didn't believe him until he showed me. They were definitely human footprints, although quite large. But that could be explained by the sun. When the sun hits footprints, they melt and get larger. I took photos of the footprints and walked around the perimeter of the shed to record the damage. As I was walking around the back side, I saw a white blur out of the corner of my eye. I spun around to get a better look. The only thing I saw was white fur running into the forest. This must be our guy, I thought. So I chased him. I didn't realize until I was about maybe 80 yards into the pine forest that I wasn't chasing a man at all. It looked like a man from behind, about my height and running on 2 legs. But it was not a man at all. It stopped to face me. It had an ape-like face. The skin around its face and hands were a sort of brownish tan, and the rest of the creature was covered in white hair. I drew my gun because I thought it was going to attack me when it stopped running, but it just stood there, panting like it was out of breath. I looked down at its feet. No shoes. This was definitely the creature that destroyed the shed. I don't know what I was thinking, but I tried talking to it, but it was obvious it didn't have any understanding of language. I still had my gun drawn on it. I slowly reached into my pocket to grab my phone to get a picture of this thing, but ran, and I didn't follow it that time. My encounter with the creature only lasted at max a few seconds, but it felt longer than that. I couldn't believe what I had seen, and I had no idea what I was going to tell the man who owned the cabin. I couldn't put any of this in the police report. I'd probably get fired for suspicions of insanity. I couldn't tell the guy it was an animal either, since he saw human footprints out there. I decided to protect my own ass and not say anything. I took down the report of the property damage, and that was it. I did stay and help the man clean up the logs that had been scattered across the property. I don't know exactly why, as I had a bunch of other things I was supposed to do that day. I guess I felt guilty for not telling him about the creature in his woods. I did check up on the man again in a few weeks. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was that the woodshed had been moved right next to the house. I asked about it, and he said the same thing happened about 2 weeks later. He said he saw something out there in the woods, but I wouldn't believe him if he told me the truth. Since he moved the shed away from the forest, he hadn't had any issues, and hopefully it would stay that way. My family always longed to travel. When we were kids, we couldn't afford it. My mother, a single mom, would always talk to us and dream about all of the sights in the United States that she hadn't yet had the opportunity to see. We wanted to see those things too. So once we siblings got older, we made a list of all the places our mother described and promised that we'd all make our way through the destinations one at a time. We took her to a few of them. She enjoyed Crater Lake the most, but unfortunately she didn't get around to the Grand Canyon until after she died. So let me explain. Once Mom died, my siblings started to give up on the list. It wasn't the same without Mom. I felt the same as the rest of them, but I just wasn't ready to give up. The road trips across the country to check out the last remaining wonders of the United States became my way of staying close to her. I'd even talk to her on the road. I'd ask her what she thought of all my favorite views. When I finally made it to the Grand Canyon, I felt bittersweet. It was the last destination on my list. It represented my mother's bucket list, completed now thanks to my dedication. But it also meant I'd have to find a new way to bond with my late mom. While there, I started to think about how I wasn't ready to say goodbye to these trips. So I booked an extra long stay in the area so that I could return to see the canyon more than once before heading home. The first day was exactly the wonder and spectacle you'd expect. You don't know how small you are until you're faced with the great scope of the earth. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing the canyon itself. I'm not good at that kind of thing. What I do want to describe is what I saw on the second day. Dusk was approaching. The descending light framed the rocks and the sand beautifully. It was different than the broad daylight view I'd enjoyed on my first day. I asked Mom what she thought, and I waited for an answer. I never heard her voice. We didn't talk in that way. Usually, I'd just get a feeling. That night, I did receive the feeling that she was there, but it was interrupted by a light in the distance. I was alone at that particular overlook. I'd purposefully chosen a less crowded area to admire the canyon. The light demanded my attention, especially since it wasn't coming from the road in the distance or the town that I knew was further back. Red blinking lights began flickering near the bottom of the canyon. I thought perhaps it was a road down there, an emergency vehicle. Maybe I hadn't seen them descend the canyon. The idea of seeing someone rescued out of the bottom of the canyon guaranteed that I wouldn't be looking away. It was unexpected. It was magnetic. But it wasn't a vehicle at the bottom of the canyon. I know this because the longer I stared, the more I saw it. There was a large triangular shape visible on the canyon floor. The blinking red lights revealed more of it as time went on. Otherwise, its colors were obscured. It looked disguised in some way, as if the triangular body was colored exactly the same as the canyon around it. I wondered if it was a jet, some type of military craft. It wasn't flying, and I had no reason to assume it could, but jets were the only vehicles I knew of that depended on such great stealth. Then the triangle began to levitate. As it rose from the ground, Its canyon-colored veil seemed to disappear. Now it looked black, metallic, and massive. I could have parked my car on its back and still had room to walk around. It climbed out of the canyon and continued to climb. I asked my mother if she was seeing the same thing I was. Again, there were no words and no feelings. I was confident that she was there with me. There was no way she'd let me face that thing all alone. Besides, someone would have to believe my story. I was already repeating how unbelievable the encounter was in my head at the time. The longest point of the triangle turned and seemed to fixate on my position. The red strobe changed its pattern. I still wonder if it was trying to communicate. I've tried to learn Morse code since that night, but I can't perfectly recall the way the lights were blinking. I only remember feeling glued to that sight. I was a moth being pulled into a flame. The craft and I stared at each other. It seemed to be waiting for something. I can't explain it, but I suddenly felt my mother more strongly than before. It didn't just seem like the craft was observing me. It felt like she was looking down from somewhere up above. Imagining her in that ship instead of somewhere in heaven made me smile. She would have had some great views from inside of that thing. Then the vehicle dashed into the night. It tore toward the clouds at a blistering speed. It didn't make a sound either. The next day I asked around. There were a few other reports of strange shapes in the sky. I wasn't the only person with their eyes on the Grand Canyon after all. What I want to know now was, why did I feel the way I did? Why did it feel like she was there with me? Has anyone ever talked about that before? Was it something genuine? Was it shock? Was it even real? I want to know the theories. And I want to know if I should go looking for it again. I live in Michigan and we have a lot of dogman stories. The History Channel actually did a whole Monster Hunters piece on us, trying to see if something strange really did live in our woods. I watched that episode and at the time thought it was far-fetched. I didn't think I'd ever see anything like that for myself. The dogman is kind of like the Sasquatch of the Great Lakes. Everyone hears the Bigfoot stories coming from the Pacific Northwest and California. Here in Michigan, it's all about the dogman. I feel that usually when people think of dogman, they think werewolf. No, it's really nothing like that at all. Werewolves are normal people with a condition that turns them into a bloodthirsty killer on a full moon. The only way to kill them is with silver, and the only way to appease their hunger is with blood. I'm convinced that the dogman is real, and I'm convinced that it is really just an unknown, misunderstood creature. I saw one, and I'm positive that they are just like wolves or coyotes, or even deer. Just part of the ecosystem. Here is why I think that. When I had my encounter, obviously it terrified me. I was even afraid for my life because of all the stories that I'd heard. I locked my door and grabbed my gun and stayed up the entire night, waiting for it to come for me. But it never did. And when I think back on it, the creature wasn't really doing anything aggressive. It was like seeing any other animal late at night. Just this one is an alpha predator. So here's how I ended up seeing it. I live in a little town not far from the Mackinac Bridge. I'm on the Upper Peninsula side. My buddy owns a small bar and I help him out and do some bartending every once in a while. He plows my private drive, so I do it as a favor. It was April, just when things were starting to thaw out. I was working for my buddy on a Saturday night and naturally I wrapped up work pretty late. I think I left the bar around 3 in the morning. I don't think I was particularly tired as I was driving home. Some people have tried to say that I was seeing things because of my fatigue. I don't remember feeling fatigued, so I don't think it was that. My house is pretty deep in the woods. Most houses are in the Upper Peninsula, unless you live in one of the back towns on the lakeshore, like St. Ignace or Munising. It was probably a 20-minute drive on the main road and then 10 minutes on my private drive to get back to my home. I saw the dogman on the main road, not far from my turn off. There were absolutely no other cars out on the road for my entire drive. Not many people live in the area anyways, and I'm sure they were all tucked safe in their beds. My truck was the only headlights making their way down the road that night. I'm used to seeing wildlife in the UP. We have moose, bears, and loads of deer. They're not uncommon at all, especially late at night. When I first saw the dogman, I truly thought it was moose. The reason I thought it was a moose was because of how big it was. If you've never seen a moose, they're absolutely massive, and the really big bull mooses stand around 7 feet tall. That's how tall this thing was. I was driving in my lane, and the dogman was standing in the opposite lane, where the oncoming traffic would be. It was literally just standing there, with its face towards me. It was literally like a deer in the headlight, but a bipedal, wolf-like creature. We don't have many wolves in the UP, but I've seen lots of pictures. Its head was exactly like a wolf's, with big triangular ears and long snout. Its eyes faced forward like a predator's, and they shined like two glowing orbs in the glare of my headlights. Its body was tall and long and slightly crouched over. I'm sure that if it had been standing fully upright, it would have been more than 9 feet tall. All its limbs were extremely long and dog-like. Its torso was covered in fur, and its wide shoulders looked strong and powerful. I saw it for just a moment in the headlight and then drove right past it. It didn't move or chase me. I kept checking in the mirror, expecting to see it running up behind me, grabbing onto my truck bed. Like I said that night, this sighting absolutely terrified me. I rushed into the house, locked the door, and grabbed my gun. I stayed up all night, expecting that the dogman was outside, following my scent and hunting me. But it never came. I have a security system in my house with 3 different cameras looking outside. Not a single one picked up the dogman hunting me down. And that's why I think that the dogman is misunderstood. If he had wanted to hunt me, he could have. I'm sure he could have busted down my door and my hunting rifle wouldn't have done anything against him. But he didn't. He just disappeared into the night. I can't get the image of him out of my head. He was just standing there in the road, like a deer in the headlights. He was just like any other animal. I'm sure he's a fearsome predator, but I'm also sure that he's misunderstood. Maybe we're just afraid of him because it's impossible for us to understand him. I'm a firm believer in the supernatural. I know it's real, and I've had a few experiences to back it up. I was born and raised in Hawaii, and while it's mainly known as a touristy paradise with its beaches, mountains, surfing, and luau's, there's a dark side that most aren't aware of unless you live there. Hawaii is ripe with history, folklore, and spirituality, and there are hauntings all over the islands. Popular spirits include Madame Pele, the goddess of fire, the Menehune, the choking ghost, the faceless woman of Waialae Drive-In, and the Green Lady of Wahiawa. One of the scariest encounters that I personally had involves the most legendary ghosts of all. In Hawaiian, they are the Huaka'ipo, but are more commonly known as the Night Marchers. Anyone who lives in Hawaii has at least heard of them. They are very real. The Night Marchers are the ghosts of ancient Hawaiian warriors said to travel on certain trails from sunset to sunrise. Supposedly, they appear during the last 4 phases of the moon, before it goes dark. It's said that you'll know when the Night Marchers are coming when you hear their drumbeat and the sound of a conch shell blowing. You'll see their torches in a single line, descending down the mountains. That's your cue to run and hide. You're not supposed to look at them. If you do, they'll pull you in and you'll be doomed to walk with them for eternity. You're supposed to show deference and respect by taking your clothes off and lying face down on the ground. If you do look at them, it's possible to be saved by an ancestor who is marching with them. The ancestor will call your name and claim you as theirs, and your life will be spared. Simply put, these are not the kind of spirits to be trifled with. One summer weekend, my cousin and I went camping and boar hunting. I won't say where because it's best if people don't try to go there. It was near the base of a mountain, and we had to hike a few miles after parking off a dirt road. On our first day, we bagged a boar and cleaned it, then cooked some of the meat for dinner. We had a few beers afterwards and just talked story, laughing into the late hours of the night. There were no clouds, and the tapestry of stars was a sight to behold. The moon was just a silver, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. We eventually went to sleep, but a few hours later, my cousin violently shook me awake. I didn't recognize him at first in my half-asleep stupor, and I almost punched him in the face, but I quickly saw the terror in his eyes. I had never seen him as scared as he was in that moment. He told me to shut up and listen, and that's when I heard it. A slow, steady drum beat, then the sound of a conch shell blowing. It was in the distance, but not too far away. I looked at him in disbelief. I think I may have even laughed, but he yanked me up with one arm and pointed at the mountain. Through the trees, I saw it. It looked like floating fireballs streaming down the mountain in a single line. It was them, the night marchers. From out of nowhere, we were hit with a wave of warm air as the drumbeat grew louder and louder. We got up and ran, abandoning our campsite, and blindly plowed through the jungle. The sound of the conch shell blowing was closer now, and out of my peripheral vision I could see a soft orange glow. A mist began to surround us, and we were assaulted with the horrid stench of something rotten. My cousin screamed at me to get down. I knew I was supposed to take my clothes off, but there was no time for that, so I dropped to the ground face down and closed my eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited there for what seemed like forever. I felt the warm air wash over me as the drumbeat was finally upon us. But I couldn't help it. Curiosity got the best of me and I peeked through my fingers. All I could see was the ground in front of me. I was enveloped by a swirling mist that glowed orange from the torches that the night marchers carried. I caught glimpses of legs walking right past me, but they didn't have feet. Against my better judgment, I looked up. I'll never forget what I saw. They were apparitions, shadows of towering men dressed in traditional Hawaiian warrior garb, capes and helmets. They were obscured by the orange glowing mist, so I couldn't make out their faces. They all carried torches in one hand, spears and other ancient weaponry in the other. But then the drumbeat stopped, and they halted, turning to look at me. I felt this weird floating sensation, and everything began to spin like I had vertigo. I started to black out, but not before I heard a voice call out my name. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but I woke up to the sound of my cousin yelling for me. The night marchers were gone, and it was dark under the canopy of trees. I got up and saw my cousin 20 feet away. I flagged him down and he gave me a big bear hug. He said he was afraid I was lost forever. I somehow ended up pretty far away from where we initially dropped face down. I had no recollection of what happened, other than the brief glimpses I caught when I stupidly looked up at the night marchers. My cousin and I went back to our campsite, waited for dawn, then packed up our things and got out of there. We told our tutu what happened, and she said I was very lucky. She confirmed that our family was descended from the Hawaiian warrior class and that an ancestor claimed me, saving my life. Strangely, that experience gave me a new sense of pride about my heritage. As a culture, Hawaiians revere the land, what we call the Aina, and there's a strong spiritual connection. The Aina deserves our respect, and if we don't give it, we may open ourselves up to a reckoning we aren't prepared for. When I was with the Park Service in West Virginia, we used to host a Scouts program. They spent a lot of hours on volunteer projects. It was a good way to test themselves and get their badges. Part of their service involved helping to restore parks throughout the county. Our area was a popular place for them to come and do trail maintenance and improve the campgrounds in many ways. Just clearing the area of trash and debris alone was a great service they provided. We were hosting a group like that about 5 years ago, and I got more than I bargained for. The age group was between 10 and 12 years old. It was their last camp out of the year, and they were making the most of it. They had worked hard all day, and some of their junior assistant leaders put together a night game for them. It was meant to be a kind of spooky game where they could just let off steam after a hard day's work. It involved the kids completing some kind of task while the junior leaders tried to scare them. I was pretty new to the job then, so I didn't know if that was a common activity or not. It was a bit before Halloween, so I guess they were getting into the spirit of the season. Me and another ranger had given a talk earlier in the evening, and we were just kind of facilitating the gathering and making sure everyone stayed within the boundaries. Some of the assistants had put on some monster masks and were hiding out in the woods close to the checkpoints the scouts had to pass. I was going in between checkpoints, keeping an eye on things. There was an open stretch of forest near the upper boundary where I decided to hang out on this big rock so no one would go too far. I had my flashlight off though, so I wouldn't mess up the game. But it was the kind of dark that plays tricks on your eyes, and you start imagining things that aren't there. I was sitting there and I thought I saw a shadow that was around my size running through the trees a couple times. I couldn't see it very well, so I just assumed I was imagining things because nothing was there when I turned my flashlight on. I had been there quite a while and it was getting kind of late. I was pretty sure the game would be over soon and everyone would go back to the fire to have their s'mores. But then I saw the shadow again. This time I could see it vaguely standing near a tree not too far away from me. I thought it might be one of the assistants hiding to scare the kids. I decided to go over there since it was about time to go back. I was still some distance away, but when I got closer, I aimed my flashlight toward the tree. There was definitely someone very tall standing there, but when my light hit its face, I was shocked to see these reflective red eyes looking back at me. I started to feel pure dread. Something felt really off. I started to ask if everything was okay, but then I saw that this thing had huge black wings that covered most of its body. My mind tried to rationalize it away. I tried to tell myself that it was just someone who had decided to wear an elaborate costume, but I knew that wasn't true. This thing wasn't human. Besides the red eyes, it didn't seem to have any facial features, just darkness. Plus, it was taller than me by about a foot. It lifted up its wings and made a god-awful piercing shriek, and it jumped straight up into the tree behind it where it could look down at me. It was slowly turning its head back and forth like it was waiting for something else to come. Something inside me just told me to run. It didn't matter if it was just a stupid prank. I felt this unholy fear. If it wasn't a prank, it felt like I was in serious danger. I ran as fast as I could. I thought I heard it following me in the trees, but I couldn't take the time to look around. I arrived back where the campfire was, and it looked like everyone else had already gotten back and was just milling around laughing and joking. I went and found the other ranger there and told him what happened. He just looked weird at me, thinking I was making stuff up. He had been employed there a lot longer than me. I felt like he was looking me up and down like I was some dumb whippersnapper who didn't know how to act in the woods. I just shut up after that and started to question my own sanity. Everybody else was just having a good time, but my adrenaline was really jumping. I just kept circling the camp and shining my light into the woods whenever I thought I heard something. Eventually, the party died down and everyone went back down the trail to their tents. I stayed by the fire a good long while, thinking I had chosen the completely wrong kind of work for myself. Next day, I went back to the area to check it out, but I never found anything but endless trees. Well, I did find a big black bird carcass, but that could have been from anything. It's not like it was the first one I ever saw. In spite of that creepy night, though, I stayed with the job. However, I did end up leaving that area the next summer. I'm a logger living out in Seward, Alaska, part of the Kenai Peninsula. I'm in my 40s now and moved up here in my late 20s after bouncing around a bunch of big cities in the States. Like a lot of people living here, I came to Alaska for some peace and quiet. The nature is a huge draw for me. I also like the ability to be self-sufficient. I have a boat docked in the harbor that I take out pretty regularly when I'm not on a job somewhere. Depending on the season and what I'm looking for, I might check out some inlets for waterfowl, go moose hunting, or go fishing. I grew up freshwater fishing, but ever since moving to Seward, I love sea fishing. I live with my wife Janet and our 2 kids, both of whom are in high school. Every March, the fishing season opens and I spend a few months bringing in fish whenever I can to stock our freezer chest with for the winter. My and Janet's favorite is halibut. Halibut is a huge, flat fish, and the daily limits are 2 per person, so sometimes Janet or my oldest son, Christopher, will go out on the boat with me. A few years ago, in 2019, I just finished up a job with my company further north and inland. I was itching to get out on the water and, after settling in at home for about a week, decided to take the boat out with Janet. This was also kind of a date night for us since I'd been away for almost a month. We took the boat out very early, just as dawn was starting, and headed southwest to the more open water, but not too far off the shoreline since halibut are bottom feeders. We had some frozen salmon heads and squid left over from last season defrosting in a bucket, and Janet and I were setting up the poles and gear. Fishing is a great sport, but can be dangerous, especially in Alaska's waters. The temperatures even in April are freezing, and you can get hypothermia quickly. Not a situation you want to get into if it's just 2 of you out in a remote area in a boat. As we were setting up, I was letting the boat drift, maybe 500 or so feet from the shore. We were just off the coast from Fort McGillivray, a landmark in a heavily wooded area that creates a little point into the bay. I just stuck my hand into the bucket to check on the salmon heads and squid when Janet said something and pointed toward the shore. When I looked up, I could see a dark shape moving along the beach area. This isn't an uncommon sight in Alaska at all. At first, I assumed it was a bear since they like to comb the beaches, but it also could have been a moose or deer, or even a hunter, although I doubted that. I got a little excited but could tell that something was strange about Janet. She was sitting stiffly and staring at the shore. When I asked what was wrong, she said that something just didn't look right. It was about 5 in the morning now and we were ready to fish, but she seemed really bothered. I offered to drive the boat closer and see what it was. She was resistant at first, but hesitantly agreed. She gripped the edge of the boat tightly as we sped toward the fort and beach. Meanwhile, as soon as I started up the motor, the creature on the beach turned our way and was checking us out. I expected it to run off as we got closer, but it didn't. That put me on edge as I was now thinking it was a bear that was too used to humans. These bears can be dangerous and eventually end up trying to break into cabins or getting too close to people in aggressive ways. We got to about 200 feet off the shore, and I pulled a pair of game binoculars out of my coat. It took a second to get situated, but I got the creature in my sights and realized it wasn't a bear at all. By now, it was trying to move into the wooded area off of the beach. As I watched, holding my breath, it moved on 2 feet, not like a bear, but like a stiff human. Janet then hit my arm and told me she wanted to go back out. "Hold on," I said, wanting to get a better look. I didn't dare bring the boat in closer since the water was very shallow, but I kept my eyes glued to the bipedal creature. It wove in and out of the trees, poking out every few seconds to look back at us. The trees obscured it a bit, but I was able to see longer, shaggy hair on its body, matted in some places. It was dark, almost black-brown, and had long arms that reached down past where I would say the knees were. I asked Janet if she wanted to look, but she shook their head and asked again if we could please head back. In fact, she demanded it. We switched spots so I could keep looking at the creature while she directed us back out to the fishing spot. As the boat moved away from the shore, the thing came out onto the beach a little further, but not like it had been before. It was a bumpy ride, but I could see that it was beachcombing and would occasionally bend down, again with stiff knees. When we were far out from the fort, Janet and I started fishing and didn't talk about it until I brought it up an hour later. I asked if she wanted to know what it was. She said no at first, but then gave in to curiosity. Plus, we couldn't see the creature on the beach anymore. I explained that it almost looked like a man in a black and brown ghillie suit, but one who was walking strangely. She looked at me and said she'd noticed that too, that the movements weren't fluid like a human, but they were very straightforward and more animal-like. We tried to focus on fishing, but after an hour, only caught one smaller halibut and a salmon. So she and I decided to head back in. Since that day, we haven't seen anything like the creature again, but I've brought it up over beers in the bar and have heard similar stories. Locals in the area seem pretty comfortable with the idea of Bigfoot or something ape-like around. I'm thinking that's what we must have seen. Whatever it was, I didn't get a feeling of menace or aggression about it. It seemed more to be like it wanted to be left alone and stay unseen. I never believed that such things existed until we saw it for ourselves.